All right, let's get right into it. Today we're digging into a source with a pretty bold argument. It claims that the entire path of early Islam was fundamentally altered by one single pivotal moment, a great rejection that, it argues, led to the rewriting of sacred history itself. So you gotta ask, right? How did Islam end up so distinct from Judaism and Christianity? I mean, these are the very traditions it claimed it was coming to complete. That's the central question our source material really tries to answer.
So here's the roadmap for how the source builds its case. It all starts with a critical moment of rejection. That rejection then triggers a complete rewrite of a foundational covenant, which in turn completely transforms the very nature of the mission. Let's break down how it all unfolds.
Okay, so according to this source, everything, and I mean everything, that follows hinges on this one pivotal moment, the failure of Muhammad to gain acceptance from the established Jewish and Christian communities in Arabia. So why the rejection? Well, this wasn't just some small theological disagreement. The source lays out that, from the Jewish perspective, the new revelations flat out contradicted the Torah. They altered laws that were seen as eternal, and they just didn't meet the long-established criteria for what makes a prophet. In short, when held up against existing scripture, they didn't pass the test. And on the Christian side of things, it was just as stark. The source points to these core, absolutely non-negotiable beliefs. By denying the crucifixion, the divinity of Jesus, and the Trinity, the new revelations weren't seen as a continuation of the biblical story, but as a direct challenge to its most fundamental truths. So what happens when you're rejected by the very people of the book you were trying to bring into the fold? Well, according to this source, you don't just tweak the message. You perform a monumental theological shift. This wasn't a minor course correction. It was a move that redefined the entire Abrahamic story from the ground up. And this is really the core of the source's argument. It claims that in response to being rejected by the descendants of Isaac, the new revelation effectively rewrote thousands of years of sacred history, seemingly overnight. This wasn't an evolution, it was a revolution.
And wow, this slide just lays it out so clearly, doesn't it? On the left, you have the biblical tradition that stood for millennia. The covenant goes through Isaac. On the right, the Quran re-centers that very same covenant on Abraham's other son, Ishmael. According to the source, this single change was the game changer that created the space for a new, separate tradition.
And the implications of this shift are just massive. The source argues this wasn't an interpretation, it was a complete replacement. By rerouting the covenant, it disqualified any claim to continuing the old tradition, and instead established a brand new religious system, one that, could then unite the Arab descendants of Ishmael against the established traditions of Isaac. Okay, so let's put this on a timeline, because the story the source tells unfolds in two completely different acts. It's a tale of two cities, really, and it all starts in Mecca. So here's the basic framework you need to keep in your head. For 12 long years in Mecca, the mission has one distinct character. But that migration to Medina in 622 AD, the Hijra, that's the turning point. According to the source, after this moment, the entire game changes. During this first phase in Mecca, the message is described as one of persuasion and patience. Muhammad is presented as a warner, right? He's calling people back to the idea of one God. And he's still actively seeking recognition from the local Jews and Christians, hoping they'll see him as a prophet in their own lineage. And to back this up, the source points to verses just like this one from that Meccan period. To you, your religion, and to me, my religion. The argument here is that this tolerant tone reflects a position of weakness, a kind of let's agree to disagree stance taken when you don't have the power to do anything else. But then comes the move to Medina, and this is where everything flips. He's not just a preacher anymore. Now he's a political leader, a lawmaker, and a military commander. And the revelations, according to the source, change right along with his new role. They start to sound different, a lot different. Just look at this table. It puts the two periods side by side based on the source's analysis, and the contrast is just striking. The tone goes from persuasive to commanding. The main theme shifts from patience to warfare. And look at the relationship with others. It goes from being respectfully called people of the book to hostile and accusatory. And here's the proof in the pudding, right? The source highlights a verse like this from the Medinan period to show that dramatic reversal. It argues the mission has now transformed from one of dialogue to a clear command for domination and submission. It's a total 180 from "to you, your religion." Okay, so you're probably thinking, how can you have these two totally opposite messages in the same holy book? That's a huge question. Well, the source says there's a specific theological doctrine within Islam itself that's used to explain exactly how this works. It's a concept called abrogation, or naskh, and it's presented as the theological mechanism for all this change. The basic idea is that newer divine revelations can literally cancel out or override older ones, so a later verse can effectively erase an earlier one. And this is a classic example the source uses to show abrogation in action. You've got this earlier well-known verse saying, let there be no compulsion in religion. But then you get a later verse saying, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. The argument made by classical Islamic scholarship, as cited by the source, is that the later command simply replaces the earlier one once the community gained the power to actually compel. So let's pull it all together. The big point the source makes is this. This transformation wasn't random. It was a direct response to historical events, starting with that theological rejection. That led to rewriting the core Abrahamic covenant, which then paved the way for a mission that mirrored the journey from a powerless preacher to a powerful political and military conqueror. And that leaves us with the core question this source puts on the table. If a message evolves as the power of its messenger grows, how should we understand its earliest form in relation to its latest? It's a fundamental question about context, power, and interpretation that sits right at the heart of how history is written.